The Fake History of Africa. The image above and the two below are from the book Mappa Mundi and 15th Century Venice. A 15th century monk and renowned cartographer who went by the name Fra Mauro had been commissioned by the King of Portugal to make a map of the world. This map was completed in 1459. The maps are upside down from our perspective. I don't know about you, but in school I learned that prior to the 18th century, Africa was all jungle and steppe that was populated by primitive hunter-gatherers. Then in the 18th century, Europeans, Arabs and Americans arrived to bring civilization by taking the people as slaves. The maps above show Africa 600 years ago with opulent palaces, cathedrals, castles, spired buildings, towers and waterways, looking nothing like I was taught as an impressionable young child. Or did Fra Mauro just make stuff up, as skeptics say about 15th century maps? Here's what an article in Atlas Obscura says, bolding mine. Fra Mauro's map was the most accurate ever made at the time. He was the first to depict Japan as an island, and the first European to show that you could sail all the way around Africa. The latter finding drew on reports from unfortunate traders blown by a storm round South Africa, learning that it was circumnavigable and liberally endowed with 60-foot birds capable of picking up elephants. Through depicting the riches, navigation routes and people around the world, Fra Mauro didn't just describe terrain, but played a part in encouraging further exploration and analysis, leading up to the famous Age of Exploration and the discovery of the Americas. The map is accurate enough to guide researchers to as yet undiscovered archaeological sites. For example, Fra Mauro's contacts in the Ethiopian Church allowed him to map medieval Ethiopia in surprising detail. He accurately portrayed a number of geographical features: the Awash River, mountain ranges surrounding Addis Ababa, and the Zikwala mountain and monastery, which is still there 500 years later. Alongside geographical features, Fra Mauro plotted ancient cities that for centuries scholars assumed never existed. This assumption is challenged by archaeologists today, who have found unmistakable signs of past habitation in the sites that Fra Mauro indicated. Although no excavation has started, obsidian shards and pottery pieces litter the landscape, and small walls, old grindstones and worn foundations are visible under moss and bushes. A few close-ups so that you get an idea of the archaeological discoveries that still await us. The architecture matches the style of the unknown worldwide civilization we have been tracking on this website. An exciting discovery. Fast forward 111 years to a 1570 map. Africa is still shown as a continent covered by territories and cities. The map is called Africa and Tabula Nova by Abraham Ortelius. This is what maps of Africa looked like hundreds of years later. This one is from 1802. Africa is now suddenly unexplored, and its towns and terrain unknown, as if the entire continent had been reset. In this 1853 map, Africa seems even more desolate. What on earth happened? Our compulsory public schooling teaches us that our knowledge of Earth's geography, topography, and its cultures has evolved over the centuries. We went from ignorance of our world to a greater and greater understanding as more was discovered. But these maps show the opposite. De-evolution, a veil of ignorance over things previously known. How is it that the explorers of the 1800s no longer knew of the maps made hundreds of years before? The shift from Africa bustling with life, cities, architecture, and nations to Africa shown as a barren wasteland and unknown territory is an anomaly. Claiming that Africa was always this way until civilized in the 1800s equals fake history. Even the Sahara Desert did not exist in those days. Here's a cutout from a 1592 map. The last 4 maps above are sourced from an article titled 400-Year-Old Sahara on the website stolenhistory.org. That article contains much additional evidence not included here. Where today we see desert, there were gigantic lakes, rivers and green. The southern part of the Arabian Desert, today known as the barren empty quarter, also looks fertile, showing lakes and rivers. Arab oral history tells of the old days in which the peninsula was green and fertile, but modern academia has intervened and claimed that old days means thousands of years ago. But these maps are only 400 to 500 years old. They are just more attestation that our timeline has been grossly distorted. What's going on, in my view, we are looking at a catastrophic event that destroyed Africa, perhaps a natural event, more likely weapons of mass destruction. Was it a divine intervention or hostile takeover? Hard to say. Here's what Wikipedia says about Sahara. The climate of the Sahara has undergone enormous variations between wet and dry over the last few 100,000 years, believed to be caused by long-term changes in the North African climate cycle that alters the path of the North African monsoon, usually southward. The cycle is caused by a 41,000-year cycle in which the tilt of the Earth changes between 22 degrees and 24.5 degrees. At present, 2000, we are in a dry period, but it is expected that the Sahara will become green again in 15,000 years. When the North African monsoon is at its strongest, annual precipitation and subsequent vegetation in the Sahara region increase, resulting in conditions commonly referred to as the Green Sahara. For a relatively weak North African monsoon, the opposite is true, with decreased annual precipitation and less vegetation, resulting in a phase of the Sahara climate cycle known as the Desert Sahara. During the last glacial period, the Sahara was much larger than it is today, extending south beyond its current boundaries. The end of the glacial period brought more rain to the Sahara, from about 8,000 BC to 6,000 BC, perhaps because of low-pressure areas over the collapsing ice sheets to the north. Once the ice sheets were gone, the northern Sahara dried out. In the southern Sahara, the drying trend was initially counteracted by the monsoon, which brought rain further north than it does today. By around 4,200 BC, however, the monsoon retreated south to approximately where it is today, leading to the gradual desertification of the Sahara. The Sahara is now as dry as it was about 13,000 years ago. The more I learn, the less I believe all these dates and claims by official sources. It's easy to prove that Sahara was green just a few hundred years ago. The maps prove it. Travel reports prove it. Newspaper reports prove it. Reports from the people who lived in the region prove it. The people of what is now Sahara Desert have made cave paintings as if to speak to future generations. Quoted from the article, Rock Art Draws Scientists to Ancient Lakes. The Cave of the Swimmers has captivated imaginations ever since it was discovered by the Hungarian explorer Laszlo Almásy in 1933. The shallow cave's paintings are about 7,000 years old, give or take 1,000 years, and show human figures performing what looks like a kind of Neolithic doggy paddle. Confronted by the seeming inconsistency of swimmers in a desert landscape, Almásy hypothesized that the artists were realistically depicting their surroundings and that the climate had in fact been wetter back then. The article repeats the claim of Sahara having been fertile thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years ago. But the region in which these swimmer images were found had lakes, according to the much more recent maps. The cave painting is located in a completely barren place called Jilf al-Kabir, which is here on the map, the relevant section-old map of fertile Sahara for comparison. To make it more clear, I've circled the location that corresponds with the swimmers. Notice the topography is still somewhat visible despite the sand. That's how remarkably accurate the old map was. Perhaps the cave painters knew what was coming and left hints to future people. Quoting snippets from an article titled "How We Solved the Mystery of Libyan Desert Glass" in the magazine The Conversation. In the remote desert of western Egypt near the Libyan border lie clues to an ancient, cosmic cataclysm. Libyan desert glass is the name given to fragments of canary yellow glass found scattered over hundreds of kilometers between giant shifting sand dunes. The glass is nearly pure silica, which requires temperatures above 1,600 degrees Celsius to form, and that is hotter than any igneous rock on Earth. But few mineral relics survive from whatever caused the melting. Within the glass are rare occurrences of high-temperature minerals, including a form of quartz called cristobalite. There are also grains of the mineral zircon, although most have reacted to form a higher-temperature mineral called zirconia. Ideas about how the glass formed include melting during meteorite impact, or melting caused by an airburst from an asteroid or other object burning up high in Earth's atmosphere. Despite many studies, definitive proof about which origin is correct has been elusive until now. The article is a good example of how a false paradigm can blind researchers from asking the right questions. Devices such as directed energy weapons aren't even considered because, as we all know, there was no such technology back then. When will humanity break out of this small box? Search Sahara craters and you get plenty of samples of possible catastrophic impact. Craters of Africa in general. This article explains why I don't believe most of these are meteorite craters. If the civilization in Africa was indeed destroyed, when did it happen? It could have happened successively, but the main event was in the late 1700s. During this period, the maps changed. Oddly, it's harder to find maps from this period than from the 1500s and 1600s. There is a gap in African history when it comes to the 1700s. Just one example, the history of South Africa. On this page, we learn that the Dutch colonized South Africa from 1625 to 1820. Before that, the area was inhabited by the Bantu and Khoisan tribes. No mention of a previous civilization as shown in old maps. The Dutch East India Company erected an outpost in South Africa in 1652. The next thing you hear is that there was some kind of war in 1787. What happened in the more than 100 years between that? On the same page, we read that Robert Gordon of the Dutch East India Company was the first European to explore parts of the interior country from 1780 to 1795. This version of history ignores any evidence of earlier civilized interior habitation. From the 1714 book Atlas Geographus, or A Complete System of Geography for Africa, we know that the Sahara was still partially fertile as late as the early 1700s. The book references forests, lakes, rivers, and ice-capped mountains in Libya and Egypt. In my book, Extraterrestrial Linguistics, I showed that African languages such as Xhosa, Zulu, Swahili, and Ethiopian have plenty in common with ancient German. That fact is inexplicable unless one considers what we've uncovered here. Fortunately, there are old drawings to go along with the old maps. The following images of Africa in the 1700s contradict two narratives. 1. The primitive hunter-gatherers narrative, and 2. The Europeans discovered the interior of Africa in the late 18th and 19th century. The images are sourced from here and here. Bottom left is Mombasa, Kenya. Middle image is Kilwa in Tanzania. Right side is St. George in Ghana. The top image is not in Africa, but fairly close by in Yemen. Rather than wild men hunting game in the wilderness, we see sophisticated architecture, onion-domed cathedrals, walls, arches, ships, towers, similar to medieval Europe. The image below is along a river in Mozambique in the 1700s. The three images below show a civilized Congo with castles, palaces, and houses. The background of the image above looks like any European town. If you follow the links above, you can browse through more pictures of the time. They show a number of surprising things, such as black and white people living side by side, also black and white kings. But if Africa really were full of cities hundreds of years ago, wouldn't there be evidence of that? Well, there is. Sometimes that evidence is out in the open, such as here in Gondar, Ethiopia. But most often it is buried deep underground, waiting to be dug out. This entire very big city, for example, called Thamugadi, was buried in the mountains of the Algerian desert. For the longest time it was invisible, merely rumoured to be there. According to Wikipedia, Timgad, modern word for Thumagid, are Roman ruins of a city built in 100 CE. In Fra Mauros map it is visible, and not buried, some distance south of the writing Numidia, which is the old name of Algeria, beside the mountains in red. Even an arched gate is shown just like the one that was excavated. A nearby city is called Kapsa, which is the old name for the Tunisian town Gafsa. Here's a Google map of both. It is indicated on other old maps of Numidia as well, this one from 1855, 30 years before the French began excavating the site. Apart from buried cities, there is also evidence of molten structures, as shown in previous articles. This one is in Sudan, not far from the Nubian pyramids. This particular image is especially important because it's obvious that this was previously part of a larger building complex. What happens could be hot enough to melt stone, perhaps the same weapons responsible for the Libyan desert glass. Conclusion. This article merely scratches the surface. From what I've seen, it would be, again, fairly easy to go from region to region and uncover hundreds of historical anomalies, but they are only anomalies because our current understanding of history is false. As elsewhere in the world, signs of disastrous, civilization-destroying events have been covered up and replaced with the fake narrative of recent European discovery and conquest. By now I realize the world underwent a massive shift between the 1600s and 1800s. Whoever took over from the previous empire rewrote history to suit their own agenda. The ease with which evidence has fallen into my lap surprises me. There is no need for me to cherry-pick or bend truths. Maps, paintings, and buildings speak for themselves.